Hello everyone and welcome back to this week's revision video. This week we're going to focus on Priestley's Mrs Birling and Inspector Calls. I will be showing you how I would approach an essay question and we will investigate Mrs Birling's character. Remember that throughout the video you should be making notes, pausing the video where necessary, and you should use these notes to then create your flashcards. They've been created to help you revise for the weekly quizzes, but also it's this idea that it really should support you in your revision because these videos can be paused, replayed and revisited at your convenience. So without further ado, let's get cracking. Okay, so the question focus today is a character essay. The question is, how does Priestley use Mrs Birling to show ideas about society in An Inspector Calls? The first thing you need to consider is, what are Priestley's views? You look at the second focus of the question, I've highlighted it in yellow, and we are looking at the ideas about society. So we need to think, what did Priestley want from this play? He wrote this play for a specific purpose, to highlight the pitfalls of society, and with the hope that his audience can make steps in the future to rectify these. Before this play, Priestley hosted a radio show called Postscripts, and he used this platform to keep society's morale up during World War II. But also, Priestley used this platform to advocate change within society. So, what did Priestley want from his audience, and therefore, what did he want to see in the future society? So, firstly, and the most obvious one, is he wanted his audience to be responsible for their own behaviour and be responsible for the welfare of others. He aims to reveal the true social and political consequences of the selfishness of the Birlings and therefore others like them, so he wants his audience to recognise those members within society. He also wants society to realise the implications of social inequalities, and he wants people to look beyond their own privilege in life. He also saw how the upheaval of war shattered old systems and it brought people together to work towards a common goal. And therefore, he is advocating for this progression in society, so that idea of moving forward and continuing to work towards a common goal, rather than the regression, so going back to those old failed systems. And we see those old failed systems as a representation of the Edwardian society, so Mr and Mrs Birling's lifestyle. There are two ideas that I have made in bold on this slide, and they're the two ideas that we are going to explore in further detail. Okay, so let's look at the exam question then. So what I always advise for students to do is to look at the exam question and immediately in their exam to jot down 3 key ideas that link to that question. Okay, so we've already sort of considered what we mean by ideas about society and Priestley's intentions. The next step, we need to look at 3 ways in which Priestley uses Mrs Birling's character to explore these beliefs. In an essay, you would always explore 3 main ideas. So I jot down 3 ways in which Mrs Birling links to that idea about ideas of society. However, because I've promised that these videos wouldn't be any longer than 30 minutes, I'm going to limit today's revision video around 2 main lines of argument, okay? But in an exam, I would expect you to be doing 3 lines of argument, okay? Supported by key quotations that you would remember. Okay, so the first line of argument that we are going to look at is the one at the top of this slide. So Priestley uses the Birlings' comfortable lifestyle to critique the insular attitudes of the more privileged members of society. Now, we looked at that word insular last week when we were exploring A Christmas Carol. So insular means inward looking, so it's highlighting their selfish attitudes. Firstly, what I would do is we can explore the meaning behind Mrs Birling's name, okay? It's really interesting. And Priestley uses her name as being symbolic of the Sibyls, who in Greek mythology were female prophets. Now, Priestley uses this name in an ironic sense, okay? because obviously prophets are forward thinkers, they predict the future, they have this knowledge and understanding. However, Mrs Birling is blind, okay, to anything, blind personally and socially. Not only is she just naturally blind, and I'd say that she's naturally blind due to the fact of her privilege within society of being a wealthy member of the middle class, but also he's trying to prove to us as an audience that she is willfully blind, so she's purposefully blind, okay? And we see that moment where she attempts to sort of mould Sheila in the same mould that she has been brought up in herself, okay? And it's the moment where Gerald's infidelity is revealed, and she states to Sheila that she'd have to get used to it just as she had. And we've got that hint that obviously Mr Birling may have in the past committed his own infidelity. Now, the reason why this is really important is it's this blindness that Priestley is criticising, okay? It's this reliance that they have on their own privilege. They are completely and utterly reluctant to look beyond their own wealth and their own status in society, and that's what Priestley wants to break down, okay? He, as we saw in the other slide about ideas about society, he is encouraging his audience to be responsible for the welfare of others, not just individual welfare. Now, I know if anyone from my class, which you should be, are watching this video, I can already hear the inward groan at my next quotation, okay? And that is, the lighting should be pink and intimate until the inspector arrives, okay? Everybody who I've taught knows that this is my favourite quotation from the play, because I really think, and I'm going to prove to you, how we can use this quotation in any essay, especially for those of you who really struggle to retain the quotations. It's this idea that you can rely on this one as a really strong opening, because, as I always say, Priestley has stated the lighting for a purpose. It's not a fluke. He hasn't just decided that he's going to do that. It is for a specific purpose. Now, this purpose being, is this idea that the lighting truly represents the insular nature of the Birling family. The pink represents this rose-tinted view that they have of the world, but this rose-tinted view is built because of their own privilege and wealth, okay? And it's this privilege and wealth that protects them from the problems of society. Now, obviously, because we're using this quotation, we need to make it linked to Mrs Birling specifically, okay? We need to make sure that we're showing the examiner that we are closely linking any analysis back to the question. So, Mrs Birling is not only protected by the intimate nature of the middle class, but she herself reinforces this idea through her own neglectful actions. She's on the board of the Women's Bromley charity organisation, and she purposefully continues to instil this intimacy and exclude those who are not part of that bubble. And we're going to link it back to the line of argument, and it's this idea that Priestley is criticising this complete and utter ignorance, okay? It's this exclusion of anybody else that doesn't fit into their social standing. He's trying to highlight the problems that are caused by this idea that privileged members of society are only concerned with their own welfare, and that is not extended or afforded to anybody else. So there we go, I managed to shoehorn that quotation in for this question. The next one is another stage direction. So Priestley describes Mrs Birling as being about 50, a rather cold woman, and her husband's social superior. So the first thing you could look at is this idea that she's 50 years old. Okay, Priestley's emphasising her age. He didn't have to tell us how old she is, and he's basically indicating how long and how ingrained these ignorant, negative views have become in her life. You've also got this reference to her being really cold, okay? And this is symbolic of her treatment of the lower classes, which we see later on in the play. She embodies this unapproachable and disdainful characteristic. And this reflects those wider in society, those other people. And Priestley uses Mrs Birling here to highlight the barriers the lower class faced. And then, again, as I always tell everybody, when you introduce a quotation in your essay, you've got to pull it apart. You've got to show off to the examiner that you can say more than one thing. You've got to make relevant inferences, and you've got to show that you can add detail, okay? So I would also then look at this idea that she's described as her husband's social superior. Okay, and it's this idea that there is emphasis on her social standing in society. And this is important as it shows that within Edwardian society, this is what set people apart. The respect which was afforded to someone was based on their position in the social hierarchy. Okay, so we see that Mrs Birling expects respect from the inspector. Okay, when he questions her and interrogates her, and she gets very sort of hoity-toity over that, but we then see the lack of respect that is afforded to Eva due to her position in society from Mrs Birling. And what we need to think about, okay, is again, Priestley's criticising this. He's showing his audience that there's been two wars in society that has sort of decimated and destroyed life in Britain as they knew it, and it's eroded the social divisions between these members of society. And what Priestley's trying to warn his audience is that he didn't want society to reinstate those strict social positions in society. He wanted them to continue forward and become a more equal and fair society. And he's basically condemning this immoral and unnecessary barriers that had been created by society. So what we've got here is we've got three very clear but different ways in which Priestley shows us that Mrs Birling enjoys the privilege of life. And it's this idea that he's showing us already only in her introduction through her name and the initial stage directions in Act 1 of how insular and arrogant these people in society could be. Okay, so the next line of argument that we're going to look at relating to how does Priestley use Mrs Birling to show his ideas about society is this idea that Priestley is condemning class prejudice for the stagnant nature of society. And he warns the audience of the dangers of regression of post-war society. So again, just like before, we've got three quotations that link to this line of argument, that link to this idea that class prejudice causes a stagnant society. So stagnant literally means stale, okay? It's unmoving. The first one is reproachfully, "Arthur, you really shouldn't say such things." Now, this is the quotation taken from when Mr Birling tells Edna to give compliments to the chef for the food, okay? And here we see Mrs Birling criticising her husband over this behaviour. And what she does is she admonishes, so she criticises him, and she's obviously very eager to maintain the strict expectations of the middle class. And we've got to remember that they are in the company of Gerald for this celebratory dinner, okay? And it's this that perhaps encourages Sybil to remind Arthur of these rules as they are aiming to impress Gerald, who is obviously the family's own social superior. Now, interestingly, okay, it's important to note that Mrs Birling is as shocked and embarrassed by her husband's behaviour, and she attempts to sort of cover up and mask this indiscretion. Very minor, can I point out. And what Priestley's doing here is he's obviously again emphasising that really insular nature of the family, and more specifically Mrs Birling. For what seems to be a really irrelevant comment, you know, Mr Birling sort of being appreciative of the chef's food, but she criticises this and she's determined to rectify this issue and maintain their respectable facade in front of Gerald. However, okay, we need to look at sort of the contrast between what this situation shows us and then how she responds when she's faced with more serious behaviour of the family. So she's criticising Mr Birling for just saying thank you, but she completely ignores, okay, the serious behaviour that the inspector reveals, and that serious behaviour involves exploitation. You've got the implied rape of her son, okay, and Mrs Birling remains not only indifferent to these situations, okay, but she also is adverse, so she's against any responsibility. And although that quotation might seem quite minor and sort of insignificant, it's a huge way for Priestley to warn how damaging class prejudice is, and he is encouraging the audience to be utterly appalled by the ignorance of Mrs Birling and her family. So it's definitely definitely an interesting one to analyse. The next one we're going to look at is when she says, naturally, that was one of the things that prejudiced me against her case. So here, not only does Priestley show that Mrs Birling acknowledges her prejudice, okay, almost boastfully, but he emphasises that this is something that is normal and accepted by her. She's not embarrassed by this prejudice, as I've just said, she's almost boastful about it. And this statement links back to Priestley's description of her being cold, okay, because it's obvious that there's this commitment to being apathetic and unaffected by the conditions of Eva's life, okay. The inspector, by this point in the play, has revealed the sort of traumatic events that Eva has faced, okay, at the hands of Mrs Birling's family, yet she is just completely sort of ignorant to that and doesn't see, well, we know, takes no responsibility for it and refuses to take responsibility for it. We see that Mrs Birling is completely, or thinks that, you know, Eva's life story is irrelevant, and her main concern is solely with Eva's position in society. And what Priestley is doing here is he's condemning Edwardian society for their acceptance and enactment of prejudice, okay? So we see that Mrs Birling accepts her prejudice, but also physically sort of make sure that that prejudice continues. And this obviously therefore intensifies the gap between the wealthy and the poor. With this quotation, we see that Priestley uses Mrs Birling's character to highlight how the class system encourages a moral corruption, and he wants to warn his 1945/6 audience against reinstating that class system into society. And then finally, the last quotation that we're going to look at is when Mrs Birling says, "We've done a great deal of useful work in helping deserving cases." Now, I feel like Mrs Birling's character is all sort of leading to her position on the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation, okay? Now, contextually, we need to look at what was going on in 1945, socially and politically. Now, in 1945, the Labour government, well, not the Labour government, but before the Labour government came into power, they were lobbying for this thing called a welfare state. Now, a welfare state is a form of government in which the state protects and promotes the economic and social well-being of its citizens. And this is based upon the principles of equal opportunity, equitable distribution of wealth, and public responsibility for citizens. Now, as I've just mentioned, we know that Mrs Birling is the chairwoman of this charitable organisation aimed at helping women, vulnerable women. And we see, obviously, that in this position of power, Mrs Birling continues to use her privilege to refuse to help Eva. And we can also safely assume that it's not just Eva, there are other maybe women that Mrs Birling hasn't helped either, okay? Now what Priestley's trying to show his audience here, that before the welfare state came into power, which was in 1948, okay, the distribution of help was done solely by charitable organisations. Now, as we can see here, in the Edwardian era, charitable organisations were led by wealthy members of society. And we can also see that these wealthy members of society are deeply rooted in privilege and prejudice. So what Priestley's trying to show his audience, okay, is that the reliance on these charities isn't going to work. These charities are not distributing their help accordingly because they are turning away and refusing to help very vulnerable members of society due to their own sort of contempt for the lower classes. Another quotation that you could actually bring in here is when Mrs Birling says, "I used my influence to have it refused," okay? And it's this idea that individual members of society have a huge negative impact on vulnerable, okay, people, which further proves that this sort of construction is failing society. And what Priestley is advocating here is this idea that he is fully supportive of this movement towards a welfare state, so where the government are in charge of distributing help and assistance to those who need it. And obviously the welfare state includes NHS, includes the free education of others. It includes monetary assistance to those in need, and it takes away that prejudice and that ignorance that those small few people had because of their position of power. And here we see that sort of this idea that Mrs Birling refuses to help Eva. Priestley's using her character to prove that she and other people are overtly, so massively prejudiced and ignorant, and he wants to elevate the image of the welfare state to his audience by highlighting how widening that or sort of giving that responsibility to the government, vulnerable members of society would not be failed. So there we have it. We've gone through 6 key quotations exploring Mrs Birling's character, and we've explored why Priestley uses her and what is he trying to prove about his ideas for society. And on the face of it, Mrs Birling seems like a sort of very one-dimensional character. This idea that she's unlike Sheila, doesn't go through this sort of character metamorphosis. She remains stagnant throughout the whole play, very sort of set in her ways and obstinate. But also we see that Priestley's ideas stem from a lot of what Mrs Birling stands for. And Priestley uses Mrs Birling's character to completely dismantle those ingrained negative beliefs that have been sort of spread among society. And he's showing his audience that because of the world wars that have taken place, that the class system, the prejudice, the ignorance can be sort of slowly dissolved in his hope for a better, brighter, fairer society. Okay, so hopefully that video's helped. I really wanted to sort of dive really deep into Mrs Birling's character, plus I really thought it was important to touch on some really key contextual points. So use this video, make sure that you're getting your flashcards ready for the Thursdays, and work really hard. For year 11, you've not got long left, so use this time and make sure that you are doing everything in your power to make sure that you are getting the grades that you want and deserve.